Have you ever been kicked out of a church? Hi, welcome to the Secular Scriptures. I'm Gail, and today's episode is Heavy Metal Heretic. Have you ever been kicked out of a church? Well, I have, but that was for different reasons and several years after this little tale. And I may tell you about that someday because it's hilarious. But this is a story about what happened to a friend's older sister, the reasons given in the church service, and what she told me afterwards. The events are true, but I've changed the names of the guilty and the innocent because privacy does matter. I don't think any major trigger warnings are necessary, though this was certainly an example of spiritual abuse and definitely unfair. Now, let me take you back to the early 90s when hair was crimped and teased to great heights and set in place with spray powerful enough to punch a hole in the ozone layer. A time when O.J. Simpson was a wholesome football hero and the lead singer of Ace of Base hadn't been outed as a racist yet, and boy bands were all the rage. Preppies, goths, punks, and dweebs jostled for hall space in the local high schools. The satanic panic was in full swing, and church parking lots were still spilling over every Sunday morning because the blue laws were in effect and there wasn't anything else to do. My best friend at that point was a girl named Jennifer, and she had an older sister named Melissa. I often stayed at Jennifer's house on the weekends, and the family went to church on Sundays. Like many people from our little town, they went to the First Baptist Church, which was tied with the Wesleyan for the ones that I attended most. Melissa was 15 at the time and deep into the heavy metal and goth scene with some punk rock on the side. She had Metallica and Anthrax and Alice in Chains posters all over her room, which was painted dark purple and black with some 1970s-style Christmas lights in the blacked-out windows. She dyed her hair and painted her nails black and had spiked jewelry. Melissa was a much cooler version of what you might find in a Hot Topic store a few years later. With all of this dark glitz and glam, she always remembered her crosses because Melissa never forgot to include Jesus. She never pushed her faith on anyone else, but it ran deep. Now, Pastor T was on a mission to save his flock from the evils of the world. Satan was everywhere, lurking in records and mixtapes, short skirts, and probably Santa Claus. Anything could be an idol if you loved it more than you loved Jesus. So, guard your soul, stay on the straight and narrow, and keep away from all temptation, lest you be sucked in by the devil. Heavy metal, D&D, horror movies, video games, black clothing and makeup, adolescent rebellion, and gasp, teenage depression were all sure signs of Satan at work. And poor Melissa loved everything but the depression that was creeping in along with puberty. Now, the First Baptist Church, like many in the area, had a lot of kids attending, and as kids get older, they turn into teenagers if they're lucky and adults if they're luckier. And, as with all well-attended churches, those teenagers have a variety of personalities, looks, fashions, and problems. It just so happens that there were several teenage girls who sat a bit closer to the front and embraced the crimped, teased, and highlighted hairstyles of the early 90s worn just so, with their pastel Sunday best, and they preferred Ace of Base over Joey Belladonna's amazing vocal artistry. Their parents also had significantly more money than Melissa's. These girls made a darn good show of having Jesus in their hearts, and maybe they did, but they also liked their drugs and alcohol on Friday and Saturday nights and partied hard with their boyfriends, doing what many teenagers do. It's my job as a responsible adult to tell you to imbibe responsibly and legally, and to have your recreational fun safely. And these kids were not exactly doing that, and they got themselves into a lot of trouble. When the police reports and the parent displeasure got back to Pastor T, he was understandably not a happy man. And I tend to dunk on the guy a bit because of the unwitting role he played in my own religious trauma. I do think he meant well. Discussions and meetings were had between Pastor T, the parents, and the teenagers, respectively. Pastor T and Melissa's parents got on her about her personal aesthetic and musical choices, and similar discussions were had with the other girls about their partying. Everybody was walking on eggshells for weeks, because of course back then, when one child was in trouble, we all were. Finally, the Sunday of retribution arrived, and Melissa looked like she was attending her own funeral, and the girls up front were notably quieter than usual. Pastor T made a big deal out of virginity, virtue, living right, doing honor in the name of God, your body is a temple, and all that sort of stuff. He railed against all things the color black, drums being the instrument of the devil, idols and sin. Always got to come back to the sin. And then he laid it all out in front of the congregation with the 3 girls called up front on their knees. He humiliated them real good. Then he launched into a speech about the forgiveness in Christ. I was pretty pissed at that point because I listened to heavy metal and none of the crap he said about it or Melissa was true. If black hair meant evil, then I was born that way, and he's up there with his hands on these girls' heads talking about forgiveness, which was good, except they weren't sorry and they were just going to go do it again the next Friday, and because Melissa wouldn't say she was wrong for liking Metallica, she was officially kicked out of the church for not repenting. Because Danielle lied and said she was sorry, and would Jesus please forgive her for having sex and smoking pot and drinking, and her parents probably made a big-ass donation, she and her friend got to remain in good standing, and they got hugged and forgiven like nothing was wrong. So, of course, they could go and do it again next week. Now, I'm not saying that the forgiveness bit was wrong here. Don't misunderstand me. But they didn't need forgiveness from Jesus. They needed drug and alcohol rehab and a class on safe sex. Danielle was pregnant her senior year, and her sister passed away from a drug overdose a few years ago. Danielle has had substance abuse issues for years, but she is a decent mother, and her struggles are common. Sometimes you need more than a gold cross to get you out of a tough spot. The car ride home from that service was very, very quiet. Jennifer held Melissa's hand where their parents couldn't see, and the poor girl looked out of the window and cried silently. That child cried for a week, and she didn't go to school. She was devastated. She was also grounded. The next weekend I asked if I could talk to her. Her mother said yes. Melissa said she loved Jesus, but she also loved music and the goth scene, and the whole thing was stupid. I said, I know. She said it was all lies about the music lyrics. I said, I know. She said she didn't know what to do. I said she could dress like Danielle, get a bleached perm, and make the hole in the ozone layer bigger. We laughed at the thought of her wearing pastel pink. I said, you know we were all born with black hair, right? She said, yeah. I told her she was the coolest big sister around, and she said, I know. Melissa went to South Africa as a foreign exchange student, and she never came home. She has lived in 5 different countries and worked in charity, administrative services, and medical administrations for said charities. She's happily married with 2 beautiful kids who aren't kids anymore. She's a proud member of the Satanic Temple and gets the family dressed up in their best blacks for a photo to send home to her mother every year. The rest of the time, she pretty much looks like me. Like so many of us, Melissa doesn't believe in Jesus anymore, but she does believe in goodness, charity, kindness, being the helper, human rights, and making the world a better place for everyone. Sometimes that looks more like Susie Sue than Amy Grant, and that's okay. Thank you so much for joining me on the Secular Scriptures for this little hike down memory lane. If you found it helpful, entertaining, or healing, I'm glad. If it made you a little sad, I'm sorry. Sometimes people don't find their way out of dark places and addictions. Sometimes they do, and they build good lives for themselves. I'm obligated by YouTube terms and conditions to ask you to like, comment, subscribe, etc. I'd love to headbang in the outro, but I'm too old for that crap. Also, I know the difference between CFCs and VOCs now, but I didn't back then, which is why this video is written the way it is. I will see you next week.